discuss the relationship between climate change and resource competition on one hand, and resource competition, conflict, and human survival on the other. All of these, I believe, are closely related. Let me begin with resource competition and conflict. I study the causes and characteristics of modern war. That's what I do at the 5 colleges in Massachusetts. And I'm completely convinced that most wars that we see today and in history are driven in large part or in part by competition over access to vital materials, vital resources, land, water, food, gold and diamonds, energy, ivory, timber, and in the past, human chattel. We see this in the wars of colonialism, and of course in the past the Roman Empire and other empires, and the wars of colonialism fought by the major European imperial powers around the world, and we see it more recently in the wars in the Middle East over oil. Now the other major cause of modern war is called grievance in the literature. That is historical resentments of one group of people towards another, whether defined by class, race, ethnicity, religion, linguistic differences, or nationalistic differences. We all know that many of the recent wars and current wars in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, are driven to a considerable degree by ethnic, religious, and nationalistic grievances. But I'd like to say this about grievance. Grievance is all you hear about in the news reporting. All these wars are defined as ethnic wars. Those people are not as civilized as us. You know, the blood is closer to the surface. They're driven by mad ethnic passions, unlike us civilized people. I would say this, virtually every society on the planet contains schisms along ethnic, race, and religious lines. And we've seen this recently in our own country, in Ferguson, Missouri, and we've seen it many times in the past. These schisms are ever present in human societies. But successful societies, reasonably successful societies like the Western democracies, to a greater or lesser extent, have developed codes of conduct and laws that preclude the eruption of these divisions in a disruptive or violent form most of the time. Now, we all know that they break out periodically, they erupt. And we've seen that in our own country all too often. But these outbreaks are the exception, not the norm in advanced societies, so-called. So the question becomes, what triggers the outbreaks or eruptions of ethnic and religious and tribal warfare? And I would argue that in most circumstances, it is the intensification, the exaggeration of competition for vital resources, however defined, that triggers these outbreaks. Before the Arab Spring of 2011, for example, we saw a profound drought in Eurasia, especially in Russia and Ukraine, but also in Australia, in South Africa, and other parts of the world that significantly reduced the global trade in grains, rice, corn, and especially wheat, reducing supplies in North Africa and the Middle East, and causing a doubling of bread prices throughout North Africa just in the last months of 2010. Of course, the governments in these countries did nothing to alleviate the pain and suffering of the people in those countries who often spend 50% or more of their income on food. So the doubling in bread prices was a crippling blow, and it just took one spark, which was a case of a gentleman in Tunisia who burned himself in protest against police harassment that triggered the Arab Spring. At the same time, Syria was experiencing its worst drought in modern history. Agriculture was devastated. in the Euphrates River Valley, the main agricultural region of Syria. Over 1 million people were displaced, forced to abandon their ancestral homes, and had to flee or migrate to the working class cities in southern and western Syria, where they got no help whatsoever from the Assad regime, lived in destitute conditions, and also experienced great desperation and anger. Now, I'm not saying that drought, food scarcity, and food price increases are the only cause of the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria and other violence that we see today. But on the other hand, I believe that these were accelerating events, triggers that were part of what brought these conflicts to the brink. So my first point here is that resource competition is a major cause of war in its own right, but could also serve as a trigger to ignite long latent ethnic religious antagonisms. This is so because most human societies live in circumstances where they are very dependent on a whole set of complex ecological and resource systems to provide them with the means of survival: food, water, land, shelter, heat, energy, and so on. When these exist in reasonably adequate supplies, and most people in society at least have enough, or believe they will have enough, it's possible to have peace. But when the means of survival become constrained or threatened, the schisms in society will come under extreme pressure and explode. Now, I believe that for a variety of reasons, even without climate change, we're going to see increased competition for vital resources and resulting conflict. If I had more time, I'd say why that's so. This isn't the time or place to do that. It has to do with globalization, urbanization, population growth, the rise of China, and other factors that are pushing up world demand for resources at a time when the supply of many vital resources is either stagnant or in decline, creating a global resource crunch. So this would be true even without climate change. So even without climate change, we're going to see friction and pressure over resources. But with climate change, everything gets a whole lot worse. Why is that? That's because climate change will significantly reduce the supply of many of these vital resources in areas that are already highly stressed. In particular, we're going to see a reduction in the supply of water in many areas, food-growing areas of the world, a desertification of food-growing areas, and as a result, a decline in the availability of food in many of these areas, pushing prices up to the point where people can't afford it, and leading to profound desperation and hunger in many parts of the world. All of this, as you know, is already underway and will become much more severe in the years ahead. But that's the least of it. We know this to some degree or another. But the effects of climate change will not be equally distributed. That's the point I want to make. Many of the worst effects will be experienced in the poor and developing countries of the world that are already suffering from economic and resource scarcities and are already divided along ethnic, religious, and linguistic lines. This is true especially in Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, where land and water is already scarce and often contested among different groups, and societies are divided, and where the impact of climate change will be felt with the greatest severity. Under these circumstances, it is likely that climate change will impose unbearable pressures on already stressed out societies and produce violent eruptions of all kinds. This is the way the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, put it in its most recent report. Quote, Climate change can indirectly increase risks of violent conflicts in the form of civil war and intergroup violence by amplifying well-documented drivers of these conflicts, such as poverty and economic shocks. The poor and marginalized, whether ethnic and religious minorities, are especially at risk of being drawn into these conflicts, the IGCC notes, because, as I said, and as they indicate, these climate change effects will be felt with greatest severity among the poor, the people living in marginal environmental and ecological situations. So as we look into the future, the more we're going to see these conditions of distress, not only in Africa, but increasingly in areas closer to us, like Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. We may not see outbreaks of climate change-related violence in this country, though I wouldn't rule it out, but we'll certainly be exposed to the consequences. At the very least, we'll be affected by a growing flood of climate refugees and accompanying anti-immigrant violence. Many of our allies, especially in Europe, will face similar challenges, fueling the rise of neo-Nazi movements, which are on the rise, and which are fueled by anti-immigrant feelings. And also related to this, we see the disintegration and breakdown of states and regional unions like the EU. Many of our key allies in the developing world, like Mexico and Nigeria, could face civil war and collapse, leading to the intervention of US forces. Insurgent, sectarian, jihadist groups will thrive in this environment, fueling unpopular discontent over the existing government's inability to meet their basic needs. This is the essence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or Boko Haram in Nigeria. In the worst case, major powers like India and Pakistan will go to war over disputed sources of water and other resources. This is the worst case scenario. In the end, these social and military consequences of climate change could prove far more harmful and destructive to human health and survival than the purely environmental consequences of climate change, which is what we hear about the most, like rising temperatures and the destruction of habitats and the threat to polar bears. It's for this reason that I believe that climate change is, first and foremost, a threat to peace and human survival. And that the only sure path to peace in the 21st century is a path that leads to climate action and global resource equity, along with nuclear disarmament and war prevention, the causes that we have traditionally championed. In fact, war prevention and climate action have now become interdependent. It also means that the climate movement must recognize the peace and conflict dimensions of climate change. This is not just an environmental problem on steroids, but a threat to the survival of human societies writ large, but especially a threat to the poorest and most vulnerable on the planet. There is, in other words, a profound human justice dimension to climate change that we ignore at our peril. Unless we recognize that the principal victims of climate change are likely to be the marginalized, the poor, ethnic and religious minorities who are going to become the troops for the jihadist movements we see if we don't address this, we will not take the actions necessary to avert the catastrophic effects that will unleash global chaos and violence. So to conclude, not only must we do everything we can to prevent the worst effects of climate change, but we have to do all we can to alleviate poverty in the developing world, to protect the peoples most at risk, and to promote equity in the allocation of vital resources. And as I see it, this last point, promoting the equity in the distribution of food and water and land is the most basic and essential task for assuring peace in the world in the years ahead. Thank you.
You know, in preparation for tonight's meetings, I gave a lot of thought to my contribution and what I could bring to the discussion table. I decided that I could best contribute by exploring with you the issues and the questions that I've grappled with as an African-American male labor communicator. I stand at the moment at the interconnection of class and race in our nation. And I spent a lot of time exploring those connections, trying to tease out the differences and the similarities. And I've come to the conclusion a long time ago, that the two are so intertwined. Where am I? In our nation's past and present, that one cannot really be discussed without discussing the other. This is important because it informs my activism and involvement in climate protection. I guess I better keep my hand on it. The birth of my grandchildren, beginning about 10 or 11 years ago, helped spark my interest in the environment. It was around that time that I heard, and I was struck by the Lakota Sioux proverb, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it for our children." The protection of our climate began to make its way into the front of my consciousness after that. My challenge has always been, as a journalist, how best to connect the issue to my members' daily lives. Some of the answers were staring me right in the face, but I was not conscious. For example, I grew up in East Harlem, where until the mid and late 1950s, I had never seen a playground. And the roach infestation in my neighborhood had driven the asthma level through the roof. Thus, union work involves organizing members to defend and extend their interests. But this cannot be done without solidarity, the essence of progressive trade unionism. Harry Bridges, the leader of the West Coast Longshoremen's Union during labor's heyday, once said, "The most important word in the language of the working class is solidarity." That has not changed. Struggles are successful to the extent that members are able to build bridges of solidarity from the shop floor to the workplaces, to their communities, to actually across international borders. Chief among the many reasons for the decline of the U.S. labor movement was its failure to recognize and follow this principle. Solidarity is not charity. It is the simple recognition of our commonality and the acting on that shared common interest. Particularly for workers, capital knows no borders, and neither should we. We are all connected in many ways, but often those connections aren't evident. In other words, why should a New York City registered nurse or home care attendant care about voting laws in Texas, the drought in California, or war in the Middle East? I often find by speaking to the member, she reveals in her own experiences the thread that connects her to the larger issues. Now, if I haven't lost you yet, that brings us to September 21st. Climate change connects us all. It is the overriding issue of our time. Of course, we are not all affected equally, but none of us can escape its consequences. We cannot climb under our desks as we did in the 1950s. No, our liberation is not just tied to the people on the planet, but also to the health of the planet itself. And the organizers of the People's March appear to have gotten this right. They realize that this is not business as usual, and that the despoiling of our communities and planet is too important to be left to the environmentalists, and that we need the broadest and most diverse movement possible to make the changes that are necessary. And I believe people are making a connection. I am overwhelmed and overjoyed that as of this date, more than 700 organizations have endorsed the People's March. Is that right? 1,000. Is it 1,000 now? Okay. 700 about a week ago. 1,000, that's overwhelming. The task before us is to even broaden this and to build a force strong enough to challenge the fossil fuel industry and those who do its bidding in our legislative chambers. I see the week of actions, and September 21st in particular, as the bridge to the far bigger and broader movement that will move the protection of our planet to the forefront of national issues. Individuals and organizations will take different paths to that bridge, but to ensure the success of our mission, we must also walk in solidarity with those we ask to join us. Of course, there will be some at the march that we would rather not see again. That always happens. I'm speaking mainly about those, but I'm speaking in terms of solidarity about those we continually ask to join us, but we're too slowly to join them. Perhaps that's because we don't see the connections. For example, in 1199 and other workers in healthcare, it is easy to discuss public health and the environment. But we are not always able to connect the climate change dots. That has changed somewhat since Superstorm Sandy. Our members, healthcare members, particularly along the coast, were affected both as residents and as caregivers. As we know, warm water fuels hurricanes, and the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean is about 2 degrees warmer on average than it was a century ago. We also are more flood prone because water levels around New York are nearly a foot higher than they were a century ago. And 1199ers along the East Coast live and work in or near the most flood-prone cities in the nation, including Jacksonville and Miami, Florida, New York, and Boston. Hopefully, some of the 1199ers that will be marching on September 21st will come from the South Bronx, where 40,000 1199ers or members of their families suffer from asthma in one of the nation's most toxic communities. To get to the march, they'll have to pass the inordinate number of power plants, waste treatment plants, diesel trucks, and poor neighborhoods to get there. Members with relatives in the Philippines, Haiti, and other island nations are also beginning to see the connections. Transportation workers will find their way to the march because they're clearly one of the solutions to the problems. And building service workers who install and use sustainable technology to reduce their building's carbon footprint also understand these connections. Yet, we still have a long way to go within the House of Labor. There are those within labor who have chosen the path of immediate jobs over the long-term safety of our communities. And I think that reflects, at least partly, on our inability to force our political leaders to offer these workers viable alternatives. Rather than build the Keystone XL pipeline, construction workers should be put to work replacing the thousands of decaying pipes in our nation's infrastructure. Why not retire and retrain coal miners in renewable energy technologies? I believe we can find a path to a just transition for these workers. Our demand on September 21st should not be to defend our climate, but to demand millions of decent, unionized climate jobs, not only for existing workers, but for black and brown youth who have had the employment doors shut in their faces. We owe it to them and our sisters and brothers around the world to reduce the use of fossil fuels and emit greenhouse gas emissions. Today, there is no greater expression of international solidarity. We all know that those who suffer from the climate crisis are those nations and people least responsible for the warming. Several Pacific islands are on the eve of destruction. For Tuvalu, the time is now. But so too it is within our own boundaries. The statistics in the African American, Latino, and Native American communities tell the tale. I mentioned earlier the number of asthma sufferers in the South Bronx. A commission on racial justice found that 3 out of every 5 African American Latinos live in areas near toxic waste sites. The same study tells us that approximately half of all Native Americans live in communities with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. African Americans are 79% more likely than whites to live in neighborhoods where industrial pollution is suspected of causing the greatest health dangers. 96% of African American children who live in inner cities have unsafe amounts of lead in their blood. These communities will take the path of eliminating environmental racism to the September 21st bridge. With them will be sisters and brothers demanding rights that were supposed to have been granted to us almost 150 years ago. Among the constitutional amendments passed after the Civil War was the 14th Amendment, which holds that no person could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and that no person should be, quote, denied equal protection of the laws. The killings of Eric Garner and Michael Brown and environmental racism are connected. Just as people of color and the poor are disproportionately affected by climate change, so too are women overall. This is especially true in the developing world, where women do most of the farming and work the land, but it is also true in the United States. Hurricane Katrina, for example, displaced 83% of single women in the region. Thus, women will take the road to the march of emissions down, women's rights up. The anti-war movement will also be there, and I think Michael and others have made clear that the relationship between global warming, protection of the climate, and war and peace.